We'll stay with that issue because after finding a caravan with enough explosives to kill hundreds of Jews in a mass casualty terror attack, you think that the Prime Minister would be the first leader Australians would hear from. But no, yet again, it was the New South Wales Premier taking the lead.
It is utterly appalling and shameful that an individual would spray racist, hate-filled messages on a school. It tells you everything you need to know about how appalling these bastards are.
That was him picking up, of course, on more anti-Semitic attacks this morning. But meanwhile, over on Morning Breakfast Television, we had the Treasurer, the next Labor PM in waiting, if you believe what he's telling his colleagues, say this.
This is obviously a terrifying development, and what it shows is that the fears that a lot of Australians in the Jewish community have are not always unfounded.
Not always unfounded, meaning what? That sometimes they are? That Jews sometimes make up claims that they've had their synagogues bombed, that their cars are burnt, that their homes are hit with graffiti? Because the evidence, the facts, are the very opposite. And comments like that are disgraceful. They're unbecoming of anyone in any position of authority. Now, later this afternoon, after being pushed hard by Sky News, the Treasurer tried to walk back those comments. But you be the judge. But in terms of the federal government's official response to these revelations of a likely terror plot, it wasn't until well into the morning that we actually heard from the Prime Minister.
This is a time for unity and for the country to come together against these atrocities and these appalling acts. Not a time to look for political partisanship or to make political points. I don't intend to do so.
Political partisanship? Contrast those weak words about what he says about supporting Jewish Australians with the reality of what he's actually done. At the UN, after almost 7 decades of bipartisanship, he's forced us to vote against Israel. He's forced Australia to take a position that in effect rewards the terrorists over the only democracy in the Middle East. He's handed out 3,000 visas to people from Gaza with all but no security checks. And once they're here, around 70% have been allowed to apply to stay permanently. Now, if that happens, they'll all then bring their relatives to Australia, and those numbers will treble. Despite the bile coming out of mosques in Sydney and Melbourne, well, no hate preachers have been deported, no anti-Semitic protesters have had their visas cancelled, no university encampments have been broken up, and at least by the federal police, we've hardly seen any arrests. This is the weakest Prime Minister in living memory. And the Albanese government is worse than Whitlam, because at least Whitlam looked and sounded like a leader and was in charge of events rather than just responding to them. Today, there are signs that the Prime Minister's own team is losing faith with him. Assistant Treasurer Stephen Jones, well, he's just announced his retirement, a signal that he expects the government to lose. We know that the West Australian Labor Premier doesn't want the Prime Minister anywhere near him ahead of his election on March 9. And today there are reports that some Labor MPs don't want the PM coming to their electorates. The PM is deluded if he thinks the difference between winning and losing is more elbow. That's the line he spun his colleagues as support for the Voice plummeted. He told the caucus, just keep faith, I'll turn it all around, until he didn't. Because the more the Prime Minister said in favour of the Voice, the less Australians liked it. And that's what's happening here now. The more people see of the Prime Minister, the more they're walking away from Labor in the polls. Now, if the polls are accurate, they expose the truth. There's been no recovery of that downward trend for well over 16 months. To me, it looks terminal, or it will be terminal the more time they give Peter Dutton to get his message out and campaign. At least the Prime Minister's office managed to restrain him from indulgent appearances at the cricket and the tennis over summer. But there's a serious breakdown in his office if they allow happy snaps like this to be taken and posted on social media of a high rollers fundraiser with discredited former Premier Daniel Andrews and assortment of dubious others. Yesterday's lower inflation figures had Labor luminaries from the Prime Minister down, boasting about Labor's economic management and not so subtly trying to heavy the Reserve Bank governor into a rate cut.
Now, the soft landing that we have been planning for and preparing for is now looking more and more likely.
Labor seem to think that a 0.25% cut in mortgage rates, if that happens, after 13 rate hikes, will be their political salvation, even though that would still leave a standard home loan percentage 4 percentage points higher than when Labor took office. And the average home buyer still $20,000 a year worse off. It'd be the contemporary equivalent of John Howard's 15 minutes of economic sunshine after the Keating recession. 7 successive quarters of negative growth per person means that the Albanese household recession is way, way worse than Keating's. In terms of real disposable income, once mortgage costs are taken into account, the Coalition reckons there's been a 10% hit on your living standards, made worse by Labor's renewables-only energy policy and its addiction to ever more government spending and handouts. Today it seems that Labor's jobs-destroying so-called nature-positive environmental legislation, well, that's back on the table to appease the Greens, even though the Prime Minister earlier promised to kill it off to appease the WA Premier. This is just a foretaste of the economic vandalism that would be our country's fate should the Prime Minister need to do a deal with the Greens to survive.
And we now find out that there's a secret deal that's been signed between the Greens and the Labor Party about introducing a bill which will stop mining in its tracks in WA, which would destroy the WA economy, not to mention the national economy. So if the Prime Minister is trying to stitch up a secret deal before the election, he should release that detail so that people know about it before they vote at the election.
You blow up WA, you blow up mining, you blow up the budget. And a deal with the Greens would be the worst possible election outcome. The next worst, and probably now highly unlikely, would be a majority Labor government. But the best outcome, and the one that looks more and more likely to me, would be a clear coalition win to send Mr Copacabana packing into that retirement that clearly he's already planning.